Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to this TechStrong Learning experience brought to you by PlanView. My name is Cody, and I'm the host of TechStrong Learning, and we have an exciting panel ahead. Before we get this thing kicked off, we do have just a couple of housekeeping notes I'd like to review. First off, today's session is being recorded. So if you miss any of our discussion, perhaps you'd like to rewatch or maybe share with a friend, the on-demand recording will be made available shortly after we conclude this live session today. If you want to engage with us, there are a couple of options for you to do so. The first of which is the chat tab, which can be found on the right side of your screen. I'd like you to start testing that function out for me right now by letting us know from where you are joining us. If you have any specific questions for our speakers, we do want you to direct those to the Q&A tab directly to the right of where it says chat. This just helps us keep track of those questions better, and we will try to address those as soon as we can. We do have a couple of handouts available. They are on the final slide of this presentation through a QR code, but you can also access them in our handouts panel. And of course, before we close out, we will be giving away 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So be sure to stick around for the duration of our discussion today. And our topic is the calculus of value stream management, delivering outcomes in times of change. And I'm joined by Carmen DeArdo, Principal Flow Advisor at PlanView, Chris Gallivan, Principal Flow Advisor at PlanView, and kicking off our conversation for us today is going to be Lee Reed, Senior Value Stream Architect at PlanView. So Carmen, Chris, and Lee, thank you all so much for joining me today. Lee, do you want to get this thing going?
Yeah, thank you, Cody. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our session, and thanks for joining. Probably some of you wondered, why is this called the calculus of value stream management? Well, we thought that would be good for a couple of reasons. One, first of all, calculus, the Latin for calculus, or the Latin word calculus stands for pebble, and the Romans used pebbles or calculus to as a means of counting, computation on counting boards. And later, like I've noted here, as we think about mathematics and calculus, the mathematical study of change, we started to get into understanding deeply, things like the rate of change of a curve, the area under a curve, and so on, if you remember from your calc books in the day. And today what we're going to do is dive in a little deeper and understand the study of the changes that we see in software delivery in terms of practices that we've applied, and a little deeper look into value stream management. A second reason why we titled this the Calculus of Value Stream Management is that one of our speakers, Carmen, back in 2015, delivered this paper and a talk as well entitled The Calculus of DevOps. And you can still get to this paper today from devops.com. It was probably one of the first papers and webinars that were put out there back then. And here's a quote I pulled from that session, Carmen, where you talked about unicorns and some of the things that were happening there today. Sometimes we call those big tech, and some of the things we needed to learn in terms of applying those same kinds of practices to what we're doing in traditional industries where software is becoming more and more important, and we need to understand how do we get from ideation through delivery, how do we provide better productivity and improve time to value for our customers in our world of software delivery inside large enterprises. And a third piece of this is all about the evolution that we've gone through and understanding things like lean principles, where we're talking about practices and principles around listening to the voice of the customer, understanding and identifying the value stream, making work flow by eliminating bottlenecks and waste, creating pull systems, and seeking perfection. Those kinds of principles and practices have been applied not only in manufacturing, but across many different industries. And as we've been applying those in the software development world with things like our work in agile and scaled agile practices, and how we evolved and got deeper into understanding where we needed to add automation and pulled in these concepts that became known as DevOps. And now in the last few years, how we're looking at holistically end to end. What is that sequence of activities that happens from when a customer makes a request until that request is delivered to them holistically across all those activities. What's happening there, and how do we understand that? How do we measure that? How do we dive in and really analyze all of the important aspects of that so that we can continually improve and optimize that flow of value across all those activities? And so today we're going to be taking a little bit of a deeper dive into value stream management, and we're going to focus on the significance of the value stream network, and we'll have conversations along the way. And I'll turn it over now to Carmen, and then later Chris will take over and we'll advance through this topic. So Carmen, are you ready to go?
Sure. Thanks, Lee. So back in 2018, Dr. Mick Kirsten, who founded TaskTop, which is now part of PlanView, wrote a book called Project to Product, working with IT Revolution, Gene Kim's organization. And in it, he came up with this concept of the flow framework. And, in the couple of years that followed that, some of the analysts, Forrester, for example, actually created a category called value stream management for the first time. And it was defined, about really measuring and improving the flow of business value from ideate, customer request, all the way to acceptance. So, we talk about value streams. We always talk about value streams starting and ending with the customer. And we really talk about how are they delivering value and measuring things from a customer's perspective, right? Not from our perspective, perhaps in IT, but from a customer's perspective, what is value and what are the flow metrics that relate to that delivery of value? So we've done a lot of that work. You can find, as Lee said, even back in 2015, Lee was helping me when I was at Nationwide back then in how we were implementing DevOps, working with folks like Cindy Payne and Jim Grafmeyer and some other folks at Nationwide. But I think we realized that, DevOps goes beyond just that right-hand side of the value stream. And it really is talking about the value stream network. And so we're going to be talking about that today. And just a few things before I turn it over to Chris, because Chris has some really fascinating slides and thoughts on this that he's developed. I think a lot of the focus initially on flow, or where DevOps really spent a lot of its time, was in the artifact network. The artifact network are things like stories. Right? When you think about value delivery, and Chris is going to go into this, it really starts at probably something higher than that, right? It's a capability, it's an epic, it's something that's going to deliver some value to the customer. It gets broken down, and then it flows through the network before it can be then released to the customer. Mm-hmm. I think we spent a lot of time with DORA metrics and even Agile itself in just a silo where we're talking about the story part of the story, if you will. Sometimes I say the artifact networks where agility goes to die, because you really can't be agile if you're just looking at part of the story. It's really the value stream network. It's really how do different teams operate, to actually combine and do their work in a way that's going to deliver value in the end to the customer, right? So this is necessary because you can't really get the whole picture without understanding and making it visible. Dominica DeGrandis has a great book about making work visible. And I think it's not making work visible also means all types of work, features, defects, risks, and debt, not just features, but also through the entire network, not just a portion of the network or a portion of that value stream. And if executives can't see that, and if leaders can't see that, they risk creating local optimizations. And we know in a way, local optimizations is the enemy of lean. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Chris, because I think you'll find a lot of what he's going to say pretty fascinating, to actually show more about the game is really being played at the value stream network. And we need to have more visibility and more focus on that to actually make the right decisions to improve our delivery capability in our organization. The last thing I'm going to say about the value stream network, sorry, jumped the gun, Chris, is this network really wasn't designed, right? If you think about it, initially it came out because of the need for two systems to talk to each other, the need for two systems to be doing something similar, right? If I'm going to implement an auto insurance product, I mean changes in billing, I mean changes in claims, I mean changes in client communication. So you start to create interfaces, you start to create services. It became nebulous, right? It wasn't designed. There wasn't anyone that architected your value stream network in a large organization. But it also is pervasive in that it affects all your value. So you're trying to improve something that affects everything, but you also can't see and was never designed. And as a consequence, is subject to entropy, which means over time, it's going to move more towards disorder than order. And so all these factors, I think, have combined to making tracking value, understanding value, measuring value very difficult. And now for sure, I will turn it over to Chris, and he's going to provide some amazing information about this.
Thank you, Carmen. Thank you, Lee. Anything I say today is really just Carmen's thoughts anyhow, so I'm just sort of voicing over all of Carmen's thoughts today. So we have been watching the work for a long time now, several years, and we use that term watching the work because that is kind of what we do. We go into companies and we start tracking the work and we watch where the work goes. This is different than watching the people, watching how busy people are. This is basically saying, if you want to release value to a customer, let's just watch the work. Let's see where it gets stuck. Let's try to help you get it unstuck. We see some patterns when we do that. This is a common pattern. We see it pretty much every company. So if we look at stories, typically we'll see that stories are pretty fast at most companies these days. And if you just measure stories alone, you're typically measuring something like cycle time, which is just how long does it take to complete a story? Usually that's within a cadence, a 2-week cadence for most companies. If we watch epics, we see the epics get stuck in progress. And we always kind of looked at that and wondered, why is that? Why are epics always in progress? And why is the flow time so large for epics? And the more that we peel back the onion when we work with customers, the more we feel like real feature value to business customers comes from an epic layer. Stories, especially in the days of DevOps, tend to get smaller and smaller and smaller. They tend to be more like activities. There's some feature that exists at a higher level, and most companies use something like an epic to represent that. So if we ask the question, why is the epic always in progress? Why does it take 120 days? There's something that's happening below the surface that we don't see very clearly today. And it takes some investigation to see this, but this is a typical example. So in this example, there's 5 different stories that it takes to produce an epic. And we see what we call dependencies in this diagram. And dependencies in this definition include not just traditional thinking around external dependencies, maybe other teams that you interact with. They also include dependencies that might happen within your own team. For instance, Team Pluto only has a certain amount of capacity, so they had to sequence 2 stories after each other in this diagram. That's also a dependency. A dependency, the way we think about it, is anything that causes you to have to sequence work. In an ideal world, if you had no dependencies, there would be everything done in parallel. When we talk about external teams, we use the term OA teams. And OA teams are hard to work with because they often have different priorities than you do, different priorities than your customer has. They're usually getting pelted with a bunch of different things, and they have their own, priorities, and they tend to take longer. So the reason why 120 days is because it's this complicated sequencing of work across internal, external teams. For many years, we've tried to look at something that basically says, where does the work go? If you remember, John Willis had that idea. DevOps is measuring 1 inch of the 12-inch ruler. If you look at the story level, that 1 inch is just the time you spend in development. And so there's an opportunity on the left and right side But when you really think of the value stream network and you think of it in this way, this is kind of what value looks like. Value sits around for a long time in the form of, let's say, an epic, and then it gets started and it stays in progress for a very long time, and then it closes. It's a little bit different way of looking at work. I think it changes the way we see things. If you think about the way software works, it works very similar to what I saw in manufacturing. So we have an idea for some new product, in this case, a new engine that we want to produce. First thing we do is we go out and design what is that engine going to be, what is it going to look like? We build a parts diagram, we sort of spec out all the parts. We call that the disassembly of the idea. And then we go out and we produce all those parts. Some of the parts are produced internally within our own team or within our own teams that are local to our area. Some of them are produced by external teams, shared service teams, other teams from other portfolios. Eventually, they all come together, they get assembled together, reassembled together, and then they go into the hands of the customer. So this idea of just disassembly and reassembly is also prevalent not just in physical products, it's prevalent in software products. So this diagram just kind of shows a little bit about how that might work in software. This is from a client of mine. Start off with a lot of demand from a lot of different sources. That demand gets broken down into initiatives and then capabilities, and then eventually epics. Capabilities get broken down into epics, then epics get broken down into stories. And then all these stories go off and they get worked on by some team somewhere in some sprint. They get reassembled, and then eventually they all make it to the customer. So the couple of things to mention about this, the DevOps and recent advancements in technology have made the reassembly, or the right-hand side, for some companies, this is almost a non-issue. It's really, nice and smooth. Things like blue-green deployments, feature flagging, CI/CD, all these technologies. Some companies really don't have a lot of weight or waste on the right-hand side. But when we look at the left-hand side and we look at the way work is being broken down and the way that impact analysis and sequencing are being done, we feel there's a need for a lot more science on the left-hand side. It seems far less scientific than what's happening on the right-hand side. So Carmen and Lee introduced this concept of the value stream network. I like to think of the value stream network as a social network of interactions, handoffs, and dependencies between teams and individuals in the organization. So if you think about that, this is how work gets done. This is just how work gets done at your company. Sometimes it's trackable in a system. Sometimes it's a shoulder tap or an email or some sort of hallway conversation. It's any kind of social interaction that might occur between a team and another team to get work done. It's very similar to what you might think of as a sort of an airplane route map. But for any value to make it through the customer, it's got to go through this network. So we can't skip the network, as Carmen said earlier. And it's also very hard to see. It's pretty much invisible at most companies. So we've tried to visualize this network. We may not have realized it, but we've been doing it for many, many years. So if you look at the activity of value stream mapping, this idea of creating a current state value stream map of how does the work get done, that's essentially trying to visualize the network. And then we have this idea of, how should work get done? Let's draw a future state map. And we do a 3-day workshop. And before the workshop's even over, the map is out of date. Why is it out of date? Because things are changing. This is a dynamic system. It's not a static system. Things change all the time. And it almost makes the idea of drawing a future state map ludicrous. Like, how in the world could you imagine what a future state map would look like if the existing map is changing right out from under you as you're doing the workshop? We've also tried to track some of the dependencies between all these teams and these individuals using dependency tracking, and this has been going on for a long time. This example is from Team Topologies. I believe it came from Spotify originally. But again, as soon as we write down all our dependencies, there's a new dependency that crops up, or maybe a dependency that disappears, and it's a lot of overhead to keep track of all these dependencies. So snapshots haven't worked for us. They're not working so well. So I think Carmen talked about entropy earlier, and I don't know, I heard the word when I first heard it. I didn't really know what it meant, so I started to look into it. And this guy, Rudolf Clausius, I believe he introduced this idea of entropy. Entropy is this idea that everything that comes together falls apart. So if you've ever owned a house, you fully understand entropy. Like, I've got so many projects right now that I need to work on. I could never possibly get to them all, and there's new ones cropping up every day. That's because things are falling apart. If you've ever looked at your skin, as you get older, your skin is subject to entropy. Things just naturally fall apart. And because of that, you can guarantee that your organization is falling apart, even as we speak. So you may think that last major change effort that you did has stuck, and you've already done that. I heard a client the other day who said, of course, all of our teams are already using CI/CD. Well, guess what? They're not. I know you think they are. They might have been at one time, but they're probably not all still using it. Things change. Things fall apart. This is a quote from one of my clients when I first walked in the door with them, and they said, "Hey, Chris, welcome. This is our 7th Agile transformation." Again, why do we think that keeps happening? Well, I'm pretty sure entropy has something to do with it. I'm also pretty sure the fact that we can't see this happening, it also has something to do with it. So I'm gonna go through some slides here. Before I do, I want to ask my colleagues, Lee and Carmen, do you guys have any comments or questions before I go into this case study?
Well, I'm starting to feel old after those last couple of slides. So yeah, no, I was just thinking about your comment about snapshots not working, and how maybe how important that is to understand, considering we do that so often, to kind of get a picture of where we are and where we need to be, and your whole point about things are changing so rapidly. Thanks, Chris. That was really, really valuable.
Yeah, I guess anything I could add, I always have to add like a sports some analogy or something. I mean, I think it was Vince Lombardi who said teams don't stay the same, right? If they're not getting better, they're getting worse. I think that, again, that just plays into the whole concept of entropy. If you're not trying to get better, if you're not trying to bring more order, disorder is going to rule the day. And that certainly happens in large, complex software delivery organizations.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times we try to simplify things into some kind of linear value stream view, and it's pretty clear from what you were pointing out earlier. If you look at how the work really transpires, it's not so linear. It is a network, and it's complex.
What's funny about this is if you talk to a lot of folks in DevOps, and I'm all into DevOps. I've been really a part of DevOps for quite a while now. When you ask them about dependencies, one of the answers they give is that, well, we should be eliminating dependencies. And that makes sense to me. Some approaches folks have are trying to manage dependencies. And I always thought it made more sense to, of course, eliminate dependencies. But if you can't see the dependencies, you really can't see them. Certainly not at a holistic level. I actually think there's far more dependencies than you think there are.
Yeah.
Because even if you've been eliminating them, that doesn't mean they're going to stay eliminated. That actually, if you don't change the system, they're probably just going to grow back like a new limb on some sort of animal. I mean, you might think it's gone, but it might just grow right back. A leader leaves the org, a new leader comes in, all of a sudden it's back.
Yeah. Well, also your point about sequential dependencies, those aren't obvious, like our people may not think of that as a dependency because it's within the control of a given maybe team or whatever, right? Yeah.
All right. So I wanted to think about, or just imagine what we might be able to do about this. So it's great. It's great that we have this problem. Tell us how to solve it. I've just got some ideas on how we might be able to do this, and I'm looking for any other ideas that anyone might have. So this is a case study that I took from a client of mine. This is a large company, a large Fortune 500 company. They have a typical scenario that I see at a lot of companies. So these two graphs, the one on the left, the orange line is the work in progress. So this, or the demand on the organization, the demand is growing. It's increasing over time. And if we look at the bottom green line on the first graph, that's the throughput. So the throughput is pretty static. It's pretty much the same. So when you get this scenario where the demand is growing and the throughput's the same, there's only really a couple of things that could happen. And on the right-hand side, you see what's happening for this company. Their flow time, or their time to market, is growing. It's continuing to grow. And it honestly, mathematically, has no place to do but grow. It's going to keep going. So how do we help this company? Well, I think I heard Carmen say earlier, where there's a lot of things that we could do to help them improve, but what is the best place to invest? That's really what we're trying to do, is help them understand where could they invest to affect this, to get this flow time under control, maybe to increase the throughput so that the demand comes down. So when we think about hard problems, things that are hard to see, hard to visualize, I did some research and I found there's a lot of other folks, a lot of other places in the world that are having the same sort of challenges. They can't see what's happening, and it's complex. I came across this example. It was based on graph theory and network visualizations. This is a transportation cluster of airports around the world. And basically, graph theory and network visualizations, each bubble or node, as they're called, represents, in this case, an airport. And then the lines between them represent, some people call those edges or links. Those represent routes from one airport to another. So they've used this approach. It's been around for like 50 years. And it comes with a lot of built-in techniques for analyzing data and visualizing data to see things that they weren't seeing before they did this. So I thought, why wouldn't we try something similar like this with our organizations and with specifically with our value stream networks, to see if we could see some things that maybe there's kind of hard for us to see through other techniques and other means. In order to produce what I've done, I took a bunch of dependency data that I got from this organization that we're studying here. And they had been tracking their dependencies in Jira, so I dumped the dependencies and anonymized them, of course. And I used an open source tool called Gephi, and I basically fed the dependency information into the tool to basically visualize what the graph would look like for this network. And then I also joined up with the graph some information from value stream management, which helps us to understand how the teams are progressing in terms of flow. The way this works, each one of the nodes here is going to be a team within the organization. The size of the node will be, we'll play with the size of the node. We'll try to use different metrics to depict the size of the node. The lines between nodes are relationships between them, dependencies between them. And then the loops are internal dependencies. So that would be an example of a dependency that the team had within its own walls. So let's take a look at this and see if we can find where to invest. So the first rough graph that I came up with was this one here. And in this case, I have all the teams as nodes, and I have the links between them for the dependencies. The size of the bubbles or the nodes is the number of dependencies. So while this is interesting, it doesn't really tell us that much. I mean, we can see that this one here called Pipedream has the most dependencies. We can see there's a few others that have a lot of dependencies, but there's a lot more that we would need to know to get an insight out of this. So if I move from number of dependencies and instead I make the size of the node the current flow time, which is the time that it takes for them to deliver value to their customer, I get kind of a different story. So even though Pipedream has a lot of dependencies with other teams, it has a really tiny flow time. Maybe Pipedream is like an SRE team that produces a lot of things for a lot of people, but it does it really fast. Maybe we don't need to invest there. We don't care about that. But QAS, even though they don't have that many dependencies, if you ever do rely on QAS, it's going to take a long time because they have a long flow time. However, one thing that we know about flow is that just because some of the work is completing in a certain amount of time doesn't mean all the work is completing in that same amount of time. So perhaps we should look at what we call projected flow time, which is if you apply the flow time for all the work, not just the work you're completing, but if you forecast what the work in your backlog would take, given the size of your backlog and your historical performance, what would that look like? So I made the bubble size the projected flow time, and it changed the picture. So what it kind of showed is that a lot of the teams in the org had what we call aging WIP, or aging work in progress. So the first one was a little misleading. This one might be a little closer to reality for all the work. Again, though, similar to where I started, if there's someone here with a large projected flow time like Pluto, but they have a really tiny number of dependencies, maybe I don't care. Maybe that's not really where to invest. The place to invest, as I did this walk, might be the place where you multiply the number of dependencies times the projected flow time. So in other words, this is like a weighted picture of what are the most impactful teams where we can make an investment that might actually drive down the flow time for the organization. So in this case, Prodigy and Falcor were the two that came out of this analysis. Now, this was just a simple walk that I did just based on my limited knowledge of graph theory and network visualizations, but it does show that I can see something that I couldn't see before. So my theory is that if someone who really knew what they're doing took this and did this, they probably could get a lot of value out of this. Go to the next slide. So the problem with this slide, though, is this is a snapshot. So just like the other snapshots I showed you before, this is changing. It's a dynamic world. It's a dynamic organization. Things change. New software is being written every day. New dependencies are forming every day. So we need a way to view this dynamically. And it turns out that graph theory and network visualizations also have dynamic graphs that you can view and you can watch them change over time. So it's a good fit. This is a good model that fits this problem. So what I'm showing here is that if this was our network in Q2 of 2022, Prodigy and Falcor is where we want to invest. Perhaps we made that investment and now we see the bubbles shrink, which is good. But then we see a new bottleneck arise. So Pluto arises. So maybe now is the time to invest in Pluto. And then if we get to Q2 2023, this one's called the management. So maybe we need to invest in the management. You can also see that these two, Prodigy and Falcor, are getting a little bit larger. So maybe that change didn't stick. Maybe entropy is starting to kick in here, and we need to do something about this. When I was in manufacturing, when I started my career, we had a system that told us at any point in time what was happening on the plant floor. And we could be proactive. We could see what was happening with the machine before it happened. We could plan maintenance on machines as we could see them starting to wear down. What I'm suggesting is that in software has become the new manufacturing. It has become the new source of value for us. It clearly is where we're making most of our money. Therefore, we need to start treating it with the same sort of rigor that we treated manufacturing, 10, 20 years ago. Applying some of these real-time views so we can see what's happening as it's happening and watch the impact of our changes as they're happening. So I'm going to leave you with a few other tips that came from this analysis and some of the observations that we've made. And please, Lee and Carmen, as I walk through this, make comments if you want to say something. So when we think of how to measure value, which is kind of what we talked about earlier, what we've noticed is that when Waterfall was here, and some companies, I guess that's still here, but we had a pretty good definition of value. I mean, it was big, bulky pieces of value, but at least we knew what they were. We were going to deliver these big, giant new features or new functionalities. And then along came DevOps, and along came, modern practices, and the pendulum swang all the way to the left. And now everybody's measuring stories, and they're trying to say, I can complete a story in 5 days. I can complete one in 1 day. But when we really look at the stories and we look at the value that's being released to the customers, it doesn't jive with that story. We believe the pendulum is going to swing back. towards the middle, which is what we call a feature. Somewhere between a project, somewhere between a story. There's some piece of value that we need to focus on and get better at measuring. This is what your customer sees. This is what you should be measuring if you want to improve your customer experience. All right, I mentioned that the science wasn't so good on the left-hand side of the value stream. There's a couple of things that happen on the left-hand side. One is impact analysis. So when someone asks for a change and we want to understand what does that change mean for that, to make that change, what's going to be impacted. Instead of having a SME that's been at your company for 10 years and knows everything and has very limited availability to do that work, we need to start bringing some science to that work, some repeatability to that work. So one of the things that we would advocate someone in that position is to start looking at historical performance. So if we can see that the changes that have been happening in these teams look something like this, well, then we can watch out for certain patterns. Like this team might have a high propensity for defects. So if I'm planning work for that team, I might need to plan for that follow-up work that's going to be done because they're not going to get it right the first time. Or maybe I need to plan for the fact that they're not doing a lot of tech debt. So the change is going to take longer than I might think. Or the fact that they have way too much WIP. You know, they've got a lot of work they're already working on. Maybe I need to factor that all in my planning. The other thing that we've, and I think we've stated this here, 35% of value streams that we look at have zero capacity for new work in the next 6 months. This is a common story we see. So we need to get better at thinking about these things when we do our impact analysis so we can be more accurate and so we can stop finding things that we missed or start being too optimistic with our planning. Track dependencies. So unfortunately, I don't think we can stop tracking dependencies. I think we need to double down on tracking dependencies. This is a picture of one of our products, Agile Place. It looks like a bunch of red string. If you've ever done any kind of planning like this, it's hard to do. Dependency tracking is hard to do. It can be manual, but I think we need to do it anyway. Sequencing of work is an area that we also mentioned earlier. So a lot of companies have this propensity to start work, and then when some new shiny priority comes, they start another piece of work even though they didn't finish the previous piece of work. So what this graph is trying to show is the bars represent features. The green represents closed stories. So in other words, this one is about, let's say, 65% completed based on the number of stories that are closed. What we want people to do is focus on getting to green. What can we do to put people and time and effort on getting to green? Because that's going to release far more value to our customers faster. Instead, what we see people doing is starting new things over here. We call this the peanut butter effect, where they're trying to please everyone instead of closing the things that actually provide the quickest value. We call this fastest value first. This is Carmen's term. And I think Carmen would say that there's too much focus in our companies on the word priority, actually priorities. There needs to be more focus on the word sequencing. It's more of a sequencing problem than a priority problem. Actually, a couple weeks ago, I read that the word priorities, the plural, didn't come about till the 19th century, somewhere in the middle of the 19th century. So originally there was just priority, singular.
No, that's good.
Introduced that somewhere here in the last 100 years.
Yeah, I think there's cases where actually priority can work against you, right? So if I'm on a team, and let's say and it's not uncommon that we see this, they're working on 16 epics, open epics, right? And they're doing some of the work. It's not just they're not the only ones contributing to these work. And now a high priority work begins. So here I have a bunch of things on the left-hand side that if I just got them done, I could ship them. It's like houses. I've got all these houses under construction. I could actually close them. We could close get the money from the bank. People could actually be living and enjoying their houses. Instead, it's like, oh, we got a new highest priority thing on the right-hand side. So now we're going to start on that. And again, that's getting us to value faster. So, go ahead, Lee.
I was going to say, in addition, I think we also see that things get started, but then we realize that we didn't really have a good, complete, or accurate handoff from whatever was sort of prepared for our teams to begin, let's say, their epic decomposition, like Chris has done. So then when there's another dilemma there, in that with the entropy of the network and this whole idea of a team being overloaded, part of the reasons they may be overloaded is due to poor planning and maybe poor ability to hand off or to hand to a team work that's ready to go. And I think that there are so many reasons why these things get stalled and we don't get things out as well as we might like to.
Yeah, and I think, I don't know, maybe you're going to still talk about this, Chris, but some of the things that we do don't really address the problem at hand, right? It's not, we don't do the systems thinking around it, right? A lot of value stream management is the yin and the yang, is sort of the micro macro views of things. And so, for example, WIP limits or a pull model. So a lot of times we talk about, if you talk to someone, they'll go, are you doing agile? Oh yeah, we have a pull model, we have WIP limits. But then you look at where they are, and they're very much far right in the value stream, right? If I'm letting a bunch of capabilities start, which is creating epics, which is creating stories, that's cascading down the mountain of WIP to these teams. So yeah, they can build a dam and they can hold it off there. But first of all, that work's already been committed. Just because they haven't pulled it into an iteration doesn't mean it hasn't been committed. If I drop my car off at the auto repair shop on Monday, I don't care when it goes into the garage and gets on the lift. If I get it back Friday, that's 5 days. Maybe it was only on the lift 2 hours. Measuring that as 2 hours is not going to make me any happier, right? That's not my perspective. We can't measure value from our perspective. We have to measure it from the customer, the value stream's perspective. It's 5 days. So, if you're in a shared service area, your work's probably being committed for you by somebody else. And then it's cascading down to you.
Mm-hmm.
So now you may have no choice. You can have WIP limits, you can have an SLA, but you're not really being able to actively manage your WIP at that point. The commitment's already been made and it's there and it's in your cognitive load, even if you haven't put it into your interaction. Mm-hmm. There's this avalanche of stuff waiting to fall on your head. And that creates a lot of the issues that we know we have with context switching and productivity. So, I really think the things that Chris is talking about here and the sequencing is an important way we have to start thinking about this rather than just simply saying prioritization.
I also wanted to ask Chris a question about your point about historical evidence, or looking at historically how we using that information to help us do a better job with what we're moving forward with, and on sort of layering on top of that, conditions we see are, I don't know if you call them environmental conditions or operational conditions, where companies will say, okay, for this period of time we can't introduce any change. For the months of December, let's say November, December, it's our end of year, it's our time for most revenue or whatever, most sales. So we're going to stop that work. And then what does that mean to the points you're making in terms of, does that like completely throw off the whole sort of like momentum we may have for changes, and then we start over again and the entropy grows? And what your thoughts may be on those kinds of conditions?
So what I've seen when I watch that happen is, and the more I think about this, it's like a biological system,
right?
Like your body has a cadence or a rhythm to it, and then all of a sudden I don't know, either you overeat at the holidays, or maybe you go on a fast or something, whatever it is. It messes with you, and it takes a while for you to get beyond that. I've seen that with companies, and I think they underestimate the impact of that and how long it actually takes to get back into a rhythm. I mean, flow is about a rhythm. Flow is about It's about getting into that rhythm and that natural cadence. And I've seen some companies where it appears to me they don't get back into the cadence till about this time of year, like May, from a holiday sort of code
right.
freeze. Took a long time to get back into that rhythm. And
Right.
you have a lot of people that you're paying to do that work in that sort of out of rhythm 4 or 5 months. Doesn't seem like a very good investment.
Yeah, it's like almost having to recover from an injury. If you take time off
Yeah.
from some activity or something, you have to get back into it. It's going to take you a while to get back into it. So, yeah, I think that's a great example, Lee and Chris. It's a great example.
So I don't know if you guys have ever seen the what is it called, the Webb telescope, and some of the shots that are coming out of that. If you haven't, you should take a look at it. When I put this together, I was thinking about some of the things that they're learning just because they can see things they couldn't see before. And I think clearly, obviously, the universe and our orgs, they're not static. They're changing. They're largely invisible. And if we could see them, I think there'd be a lot of things that we might do differently. The last thing I'll leave you with is when I was in manufacturing, I remember we had this metric. It was downtime. Like if a machine went down on a plant floor, it was like $1 million a minute or something like that. And to my point earlier about how software is the new value for many companies, we should understand what that's costing us. And I don't think we do. And I think it's costing us far more than we think it is. I think at this point, we can turn it back over for any questions that folks might have.
Yeah, that's right, Chris. We're starting to see some questions come in on the Q&A.
Lee can answer this first one. Lee, how do we measure end-to-end visibility?
Well, hopefully that's what we're talking about here. Is just getting a handle on, first of all, we want to look at things from a, like was said earlier, from a customer's perspective. So like, where do we start? Well, what does a customer consider value? What is value? Typically it's like solving some problem. So we're going to provide some capability that solves a problem for a customer, and that customer may be internal. For some internal products that we create and maintain, or it may be external, or maybe a combination. But really important to understand who they are and what they believe is value, and then track what we do to create that value and deliver it from a duration of when they, like your car example, Carmen, like when they drop it off at the shop and when they receive it. That's what they're thinking of in terms of time to value and the actual value they receive.
Yeah, exactly. So if you think about end-to-end visibility, we tend to think of it as 4 phases of the value stream: ideate, create, release, and operate.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think about it, most of the time and most of the things we measure are based on create. Right now, you may have like some ITSM stuff where you look at, operate and incidents and things like that, or so you really, if you look at the flow framework, there's really 3 networks in the flow framework. The first one is the tool network. So that means you have to connect to the tools that actually have the artifacts that allow you to span this value stream. So it's not enough just to look at what's happening in your agile management, in your JIRA. You need to look left of that. How do you see how work is progressing left of that? Are you using a portfolios tool? Are you tracking that somewhere? Is it in something like Agile Place? Where is it? Where is the work that represents the journey of value in Ideate? Where is it in Create? In Operate, again, it may be an ITSM tool. You need to bring all those views together and patch them together, in order to see the value across the entire value stream. And if you're not being able to see that, if your tool network, the visibility across your tool network is not robust enough to identify those artifacts, which make up then, or in the value stream network, you're really only going to have a siloed view of how work's progressing. And Chris is going to type in a better answer than what I just said.
No.
We're trying to answer some questions in the chat. Yeah.
Any other questions folks have?
There's a
There's
question.
one about the economic impact of flow or lack thereof. Do you want to talk about yield, Carmen?
I didn't see some of these. Yeah, so that's a good question. I think one of the things that we see, as Chris pointed out, the majority of the value streams and the value stream networks that we look at is the work that's invested in left of creates. When I was at Nationwide, we estimate we spent, and this is 5 or 6 years ago, so I haven't been there for a while, but we talked about this at DevOps Enterprise Summit talks. We estimate half our time was spent and money was spent before work actually got to developers and were ready to be developed. So even if we were perfect between code and cloud, I call it code and cloud, we still were leaving half time or money on the table. So if you look at how much investment you have on the left-hand side, and then if you compare that to what we call quarterly yield is, right? So if I have 1,000 items that have been are in progress, right? 1,000 capabilities or 1,000 epics or something in progress, and yet I can only do 50 of those or 100 of those a quarter. My yield there is 1 to 10. That means I'm investing 10 times as much in what I can actually get accomplished in a quarter. So you can think of that as a 10% yield. Now, I don't know what the right yield should be, but again, things are getting stale. They're getting, there's the cost of delay. There's all these things happening, that we're over preparing work. That's a form of waste. So I think that's one of the findings we find many times with organizations is there's an economics around investing in work that's never going to see the light of day in a timely fashion. And you need to understand that, and you need to understand what is the right investment to make in getting that work ready so you can actually deliver it in a timely way. Is there any other questions here?
We got one question came in about understanding queuing, and would you consider that a leading the understanding of the queuing a leading indicator or a lagging indicator, or what our thoughts are on that? So I try to answer that in the chat, but go ahead, Carmen, if you might like to talk about that.
Yeah, well, I think queue length is clearly a leading indicator. We know that as things are building up, that's a leading indicator that something's happening in front of that. So you really, if you think about your value stream network, it is a set of, I think of it this way, but I'm a little weird. I think of it as a set of queuing systems, right? And you're looking at where is work waiting? I think Chris related to this before. Sometimes our management systems are focused on keeping people busy. Well, that's, we can keep people busy, but it's really the work is where the work is waiting is creating the delay in value. It's not that people aren't working hard. It's that the work is waiting because of the system that we have in place. And if we don't understand where the work is waiting, then we aren't going to invest in the right place. I use the example of working at the food bank and loading boxes to be sent to the food and products and paper products. And if, I was loading the applesauce and the canned goods, and after about 5 minutes, it was pretty clear I was the bottleneck, right? Everybody downstream from me was looking at me like, Carmen, you're too slow. And I looked to my left, I had boxes piled up to the sky. And if I look far left, there were like more people making boxes. It's like, I don't need more boxes made. I need help loading the applesauce. But that's what happens in our value stream network because we don't have the view. If my job is to make boxes and my OKRs around boxes, I'm going to make lots of boxes. But that's not our goal. Our goal is to deliver food to people and to the food bank. So I don't need more boxes. I need more help with the applesauce. If we don't see the whole value stream, we don't see the whole network, we're going to make the wrong investments.
Yeah, I think another point we've talked about amongst us in the past, maybe to be a good one to bring up here, is this idea that in the network, you may have options that aren't, like people may say, I'm sort of dependent on team A, but maybe I can jump to team C and get my work done. And we end up having, it goes back to Chris's point about, the ever-changing value stream network. Because there are different options there, it gives maybe another level of visibility or a level of lack of visibility to understand, what is it that people will do when there is too much work or there is some kind of pressure point that we need to break through. And then we start introducing maybe social networks and social things like Chris was talking about that that are, for the benefit of getting work done, but maybe not optimized in the sense that it would
or not sustainable, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
right, yeah.
I mean, it's really about, many times what we see is we chase deliverables, right? What's the hot deliverable of this week? What's the hot initiative? We chase it. Instead of having operational reviews that actually focus on improving delivery, we chase deliverables. If we improve delivery, the deliverables will take care of themselves. But in order to do that, again, we need all the things that Chris related here to, is understanding the dynamics of the value stream network.
I think I'm probably getting close to where we need to turn things back over to Cody. Are you there, Cody? Yeah, there you are.
I sure am. Lee, thank you so much for that transition. Chris, Carmen, thank you both for being here as well. I do just want to give each of you a moment, if there were any kind of final words of advice you wanted to leave our audience with, or anything you felt they absolutely need to take away. Lee, do you have anything in mind for that?
Yeah, I think, okay, I'll make sure I wasn't muted. I think it's just really important to understand that there's a lot more to the network than maybe obvious. That's one of our initial, probably key point of this is as you dive into it and as you recognize the dynamics of it, it becomes more and more important to try to understand and get a handle on things.
Carmen, any thoughts?
No, I think, if you have any questions, you can find me on LinkedIn. I think this is an area that's going to become more front and center because, if we're looking at value delivery, a lot of what we've done already is served to optimize parts of the value stream, but I think this is still a frontier that we need more focus on. So I think having more conversation about this is going to be great.
And Chris, last one up.
Listen to what Carmen says. That's what I got. That's what I have. That's what I'll leave us with.
That always works.
Yeah.
Sage advice. Well, all right, guys, I really appreciate all of you joining me here on TechStrong Learning today. There's a lot of expertise brought to the table, and I sure hope our audience is walking away with a lot. So thank you all so much for being here.
Thanks, everybody.
I know.
So to our audience, just a quick reminder that our session today was recorded. Following this program, you will receive an email with a link to access this recording on demand. Of course, you can find it living on the DevOps website at devops.com/webinars, and then just be sure to look in the on-demand section where it'll be patiently waiting for you. The 4 winners of our $25 Amazon gift card drawing are Sherry G, Peter G, Dalen W, and Heather L. So to our 4 winners, keep an eye on your email inbox to claim your gift card. It should make its way to you in about the next 48 hours. If you don't happen to see an email, check your spam folder just in case it gets filtered out. I'd like to thank PlanView for sponsoring our program today. And to our attendees, thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate you spending time with TechStrong Learning, and we want to hear your thoughts. So if you stick around with us for just a minute longer, there will be a survey that pops up on your screen. Go ahead and let us know what you thought about our program today, or if you have any suggestions for future programs, we do want to hear that as well. Either way, we do hope to see everyone at a future TechStrong Learning experience. Have a great rest of your day, and Carmen, Chris, Lee, thank you all once more.
Thanks, Cody.